Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining the KPA Business Response to COVID-19 in Africa webcast. We appreciate you giving us your time today, and we'll take you through the program shortly. And now, Nefemi Aluko from Pakwakwa will take us through the presentation.
All right, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us, and let's begin. I'll run you through the short agenda. We'll start by giving COVID-19 in Africa the updates on what's going on, and then we'll move on to how the healthcare impacts and some of the economic outlook that we're looking at. And then we'll go into responding to COVID in Africa, both in the short term and some long-term considerations. And then we'll take some Q&As during and also towards the end of the webcast. All right, so let's start with a polling question. So how up to date are you on the COVID-19 pandemic in Africa, the economic impact, business response across African countries? So A, a lot, updated on a number of African countries. B, moderate. C, low, I'm updated on 1 or 2 countries. And D, not at all. So let's take a few minutes to answer these questions, or this question.
All right, looks like we're getting a lot of responses pretty early. I'll give a few more seconds. Few more seconds for responses to come in. All right, Nefemi, I'm sharing the results now.
All right, so it seems most people are up to date on a number of countries, and this is very good, as we should be, since information is coming in as we're looking at the what's going on across the continent. All right, so here's a quick update. There are a growing number of cases in Africa. So far, we have 22,000 confirmed cases. Unfortunately, there have been about 1,115 casualties lost to this to COVID-19. So far, there's been estimated 3,000 recovered, and this is relatively low when you compare it to what's going on in other parts of the world, in Europe, in the US, and even across the 54 nations. There is a concentration of cases in South Africa, Algeria, and Cameroon, which currently account for about 50% of the cases and 71% of casualties. So we're seeing a country-to-country variation, just as we see in most parts of when things come across in Africa. South Africa has the highest number of cases, and we also have high numbers in Egypt, Algeria, and Morocco. So far, what we're noticing is also a variation in the case fatality rate. Variation from 0 in some countries. About 17 countries have, including Namibia, Sierra Leone, Uganda, all have 0 death rates. But we also have high case fatality ratio in Algeria, about 15.7 right now. And so we're seeing a variety in different countries, the way different countries are responding. So one of the ways to get more information is to talk to some of our panel experts that are in these countries. And so I would switch it over to Sarah, if you can give us an update on what is going on in Egypt.
So it's really good to be here. So I'll give you a quick update on Egypt. In Egypt, as of yesterday, it had 3,490 cases, 264 deaths. So the death rate is actually pretty high. It's about 7.5%. According to the WHO, Egypt has 17 laboratories to test cases. And so it has the capacity to do about 200,000 tests. The population of Egypt is 100 million. In terms of restrictions on movement, there is a curfew. The curfew is from 8 p.m. till 6 a.m. the next morning. There has been closing of churches, mosques, schools, university. All of that happened around mid-March. There are plenty of economic measures that the government announced in the past 2 months. We can talk about them in more details if there's time later on in the presentation.
I'll move on. Thanks for the update, Sarah. I'll move on to Jonathan in Kenya. Jonathan, if you can give us an update on what's going on in Nairobi and how the government is responding and what's going on the ground.
Yes, thank you, Nifemi. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this webinar. My name is Jonathan Cole. I'm currently based in Nairobi, Kenya. So a quick highlights about what's going on in terms of number of cases. I'll start at the macro level and talk a bit about the government response, things I see on the ground on the day-to-day, and a bit about how I perceive businesses have been affected and what the general public also says about that. So at a high level, there've been 15,000 tests, and out of those 15,000 tests, about 300 people have tested positive. And that's about a 2% positive rate out of all those who have been tested. And then there have been 14 deaths and 83 recoveries so far. And the government actually has been pretty proactive, I would say, in terms of getting ahead of the COVID virus. So the first case was on March 13th. That was a Friday. And before then, the government had made this whole spectacle of the preparations they had made, the increase in ICU beds, the equipment, the equipping of medical staff. Kenya has a devolved system of government. So we have 47 counties. And in each of those counties was given some funds and some training, and actually medical staff dispatched to the different counties to be able to prepare themselves and their respective counties for the oncoming virus. So there was the sense that this is inevitable. So let's get ahead of it. And just in my experience, on the ground, I can say that number one, at first I was skeptical. A lot of people were skeptical by the numbers. Okay, 300 cases, seems somewhat low, and the reporting every day reports pretty much constant numbers. So we get between maybe 10 and 20 cases, each day, which, just looking at the cases around the world and the kind of infection rate that we're told the virus has. Personally, I was a bit skeptical, but just being out on the street and seeing what efforts have been taken, even by individuals, by businesses. You look at a sector like the public transport sector. So I think that the Kenya public transport scene is very similar to those in many other countries in Africa. So you have private operators who operate these minivans. Here we call them matatus. You look at matatus. Very quickly they were able to enforce limited capacity, and sanitizing people's hands, and also enforcing people wearing masks in the public transport. And these are the areas where the government was really, really afraid that the virus may take off, because obviously people live, most of the population lives in very, very densely populated areas, specifically in Nairobi. Nairobi is about 5 million people. Kenya population is close to 50 million at this point. But I will say, just by seeing the efforts, even small businesses take, individuals take, the discourse around this, and some of the efforts to ramp up things like local mask production, sanitizer production, and have those distributed, at least in Nairobi. I think I'm now a believer that the small things you do to even limit how many people are in a particular space, to limit the people you get into contact with, I think have gone a long way in Kenya
Okay.
specifically.
Hey, Jonathan, thanks for that update. It's good to hear that there are some believers there on the ground that see the things that are happening, the small things that are happening to curb spread. Thanks for that. So I'll move on to Cyril in Ghana, West Africa. Cyril, if you don't mind giving us an update on, how are things going on in Ghana. We recently heard the Ghanaian government has lifted the ban on movement. So it will be very interesting to get a perspective of what's going on in Accra.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Nifumi. Yeah, so Ghana was under partial lockdown for a period of 3 weeks. As the cases continued to get worse, in the first world, in the US and in Europe, on March 21st, I believe, we went under partial lockdown. Our borders were closed and are still closed. And within those 3 weeks, we embarked on a massive testing exercise. We were able to test about 70,000, was able to execute about 70,000 tests. And out of those, we had about 1,154 cases test positive, which is just about 1.5% of the tests that were completed. And then we have up to 9 dead cases so far. So, as of Sunday, when we got the news about the lifting of the lockdown, I think most people were of the opinion that the lockdown should be extended because, in terms of number of cases, they were still rising, and we did not have the results of all the tests that have been done yet. So the lifting of the lockdown was a surprise to most Ghanaians. I think the jury is still out on whether it was a good decision or not. But that said, I think that the government is still advising that we still practice social distancing. People can go to work, but social mass gatherings are still banned. So, for example, schools are still closed. Nightclubs, churches, conferences, all those are still prohibited for now. And I think depending on what happens over the next couple of weeks, they will revisit those bans. But in terms of our borders, I believe those are still closed for now. I'm not sure. I think another 2 weeks maybe, then they would revisit it. But for now, our borders are closed. So the government, I think, has been commended for how their response to the COVID-19 in terms of number of tests and then contact tracing. Our economy is definitely not resilient to this, just like most economies. A huge concerns on impact on GDP this year. But that said, I think the government has done a good job in trying to access a lot of the funding that's available. For example, IMF just approved $1 billion from the Rapid Credit Facility for Ghana. I think this was late last week. Ghana also attained a $500 million debt repayment freeze from the World Bank for the next 9 months, which I think is very critical for the country, considering that we're in an election year. Ghana also created a $1.2 billion coronavirus alleviation program fund, which is mainly allocated to support households and small businesses, frontline health workers as well, and many in the pharmaceutical sector.
Okay.
So overall, I think Ghana has been proactive in its efforts. Lifting of the partial lockdown again is a concern, but I think if you look at the day traders, people who are able to feed themselves based on money that they make every day, those guys were really struggling, and I think this was almost an answer to get them back, on the streets to be able to feed their families. But at the same time, we're not sure whether from a health perspective, it was the best decision. So all we're going to do is hope for the best. We're going to monitor the next 2 weeks and see what happens. In terms of medical and healthcare facilities, I think that the president made us aware that they have quite a bit of infrastructure in place to test and to to take care of any victims of the COVID-19 over the next coming weeks. So, yeah, let's see. I think we'll just observe the next couple of weeks and then we'll take it from there.
Nice, nice. Thank you for that update. It seems Ghana is leading the charge in lifting that ban, so we'll be monitoring to see how that plays out. And from the three perspectives, we see like a variety of different responses and how people responding to this outbreak in different countries. So thank you very much for that. I think for now, maybe we should pause and take one of the questions.
Yes, we have one question from Rodolfo. The question is, how testing on COVID-19 is accurate in Africa? So I think this is trying to ask how we're sure that some of these numbers on cases, et cetera, are accurate. It's questioning the accuracy of the testing in Africa.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
How we know testing on COVID-19 in Africa is accurate.
Accurate. So that is, I think, a question most of us still have. Definitely, I definitely still have those questions. You know, there's one question about, do we have enough testing capability? I think that's the first thing. The second thing is whether the accuracy of the results. And I'll speak for the country, for instance, Nigeria. The NDs, the Nigerian Center for Disease Control has been very good in trying to put out information about the number of tests and people that they're testing. Question about accuracy is still questionable. I don't know if I have a very confident answer as to the level of accuracy, but it's still something that is being questioned. All right, so moving on. So basically, we're going to move on to the healthcare impact and economic outlook. This pandemic is a global pandemic, and it's recently been said it could lead to the first recession in Africa in 25 years. There are two aspects here. There's the healthcare and social aspect, and there's the economic aspect. As we've heard from Sarah in Egypt, the inadequate healthcare structure is something that goes on around Africa, in terms of number of hospital beds, ICUs, and ventilators. So I'm not sure about any country that can deal with a surge in cases. So at this point, it's good that the cases are still just trickling in. There have been impacts on restriction, as Cyril said, the social distancing and restriction has really impacted the informal sector, who happen to be one of the more vulnerable segments of the society. And also there's a shift in behavior, as we're doing right now. More people are prioritizing, they're fortunate to be able to prioritize virtual conversations. That is happening. And I'll also talk about that as we talk about some long-term considerations. From an economic point of view, there's a projection of a 5% contraction in 2020. That is in contrast to a 2.4% growth last year. So far, each country is possibly going to respond differently. Commodity-dependent markets that do not have a good social protection program are going to bear a hard part of the hit. As also was brought up earlier in our panel conversation, the debt issue for African countries continues to be a hot topic. The African Union has put together a delegation to try and talk about deferring debt payments and also some kind of loan forgiveness. And so those are things that we are monitoring, and to be able to figure out, which countries are going to respond well as we get through this. And also stimulus packages have been put out, anything between as low as 1.5%. This is, when I say low, is low in comparison to what's the type of stimulus packages that are happening in the US or in Europe. And so far, there's been travel restrictions, and transportation restrictions as low as, so as from what we see, every African country has implemented some type of restriction, and half of the countries have implemented either a national lockdown or a partial lockdown within the cities. And so right now, I'd like to get Mambi's experience. She's a healthcare entrepreneur and consultant, and she can probably give us a sense of what's going on the ground. She's in Lagos, and she'll give us a perspective on, the response so far and how the disease is being contained. So Mambi, do you mind giving us a sense of whether the government is doing a good job in the sense of responding?
Yeah, it's difficult to say, right? Because I think a lot of what Sarah and the other panelists are saying as I was listening, I think there are a lot of similarities across the African countries. You've got, the poor healthcare systems, you've got, very few ICU beds with the equipment and the staffing, which is also important. But what I think makes Africa slightly different from the other markets is, like other people have said, we have this relatively high populations, high numbers of people living in high density areas, which makes it difficult to potentially contain the virus. So what I'm seeing as similarities sort of across the board is, if you look at, prevention, containment, and testing, I see a lot of private sector involvement. Government, you can't really beat government when it comes to being able to scale and being able to push the interventions. But in a lot of countries, governments simply just can't do it alone, and they're doing it in partnership with the private sector. So you're seeing private sector doing things like helping to set up independent isolation centers. So I think we've got about 2 or 3 that have come up in Lagos. In Zimbabwe, you've got an initiative where the private sector has rehabilitated an existing hospital to turn that into an isolation center and treatment. You've got military being put into play, trying to help, for instance, with supply of oxygen. And you've got universities being engaged to try to reverse engineer basic supplies and ventilators, for instance. The success, it'll be interesting. I think there are a lot of things happening with respect to innovation. You've got governments encouraging fashion houses and diaper manufacturers to start producing PPE and masks. So you're starting to get a local production, a push for local production, because the supply chains have broken down that we're used to. I've even seen a couple of examples of where startups are getting involved in situations where the regulatory environment earlier might have been more difficult. So you've got telehealth, e-health coming up, where prior to the COVID-19, it was a difficult sell. People ask, well, why do I need to do telehealth or e-health or electronic medical records, things like that. So it's forcing an acceleration of the healthcare sector to move to digital in some cases. And then you're also seeing things like, drones being used in one of the states in Nigeria for disinfection. I've seen in Ghana, they're using drones to deliver tests. So you're seeing a lot of things happening, which may have long-term implications for both healthcare and outside of healthcare, when you're looking at the adoption of novel technologies. What I do think is interesting, and Sarah mentioned this is happening also in Nigeria. We've had about 6 or 7 major private hospitals closed down in the last 2 to 3 days. Because of exposure to COVID-19. So what's happening is that a lot of times the government wants to take charge of the testing, they want to take charge of the treatment, and haven't necessarily involved or prepared the private sector. So you still get patients presenting in presenting in the private sector, but they don't quite know how to handle and treat. And then you end up with the situation where a 40-bed or a 30-bed hospital has to shut down to be completely disinfected, et cetera, et cetera. And that concerns me a little bit, because you now have a situation where non-COVID patients don't have access to healthcare. So if you were supposed to get, dialysis or something else, now you no longer have access. And 60% of healthcare is delivered by the private sector. So that's just something to be aware of in terms of potential risks.
Thanks.
But yeah, we can go on, but that's it for now. Yeah.
Thank you for a very broad updates. That was very helpful. It's interesting to hear about all the different people that are trying to plug in to help out, and even the sense of what is being closed and what's being opened in terms of healthcare. So thank you very much for that. So just moving on. Right now, the spread and fatality is currently restrained. Things to pay attention to is cases per million. Cameroon and Djibouti are countries right now that have a very high case per population. So those are countries to keep an eye out on. Their case to fatality ratio is still low, which is good, but just keep an eye out on that. So far, the case per million average in Africa is still 17 out per million, which is still low compared to what we're seeing around. But World Health Organization put out a report, I believe sometime last week, about the worst case scenario peaking up to about 10 million cases, which will put us at 10,000 per million. But that's a worst case scenario. And just as a note, the worst case scenario for that the World Health Organization put out for Ebola did not come to, did not actualize. So just keep that in mind. So we'll pause for any questions now.
We don't have any questions right now,
Cool.
but just want to encourage the audience to please ask more questions. Even if we're unable to answer them right now during this webinar, we can always get back to you on your questions.
All right, so I'm going to transition into responding to COVID in Africa. And here's a poll question. So for the managers and business owners, how frequently are you communicating with your sales and distribution partners in your priority markets in Africa during this time? A, on a weekly basis, B, once every 2 weeks, and all the way down to D, I have not had a chance to prioritize this. So we'll put that up, take a few seconds for people to answer.
So I'm getting a couple answers in. For the interest of time, I'll give it about 15 more seconds before ending the poll. All right. Responses are looking good.
All right. Wow, it seems people are very active, which is very good because people are responding on a 75% of people are communicating with their partners on a weekly basis. So that's very good. So as we think about responding to Corona in the short term, as we can see, communication is very key. But I'll start off by, the main thing now is we're in unprecedented times and leadership is very important. And how do we lead during crisis? First is to prioritize taking care of yourself, taking care of your health, and prioritizing your people, equipping them with information and tools to make smart decisions. And also, paying attention to some of the travel restrictions and places that people can actually go, and paying attention to where there are a high number of cases. So take care of your employees. Secondly, get oriented and stay up to date. Pull information from diverse data sources. try and get multiple viewpoints, which is similar to what we're trying to do today. And make sure you go deep down to the local news outlets. Yeah, the global news organizations have a very sometimes high level understanding of what's happening in Africa. So try to plug into the local news. Stabilize your business. Everybody's thinking about keeping their business afloat during these times. So managing cash flow is very important. Set realistic expectations in terms of understanding where you can actually export or import your goods based on restrictions, and understanding each country to know that maybe customers cannot move around. So your partners might not be able to remit payments in time. So just keep that in mind and find ways to work with your partners in terms of payment terms and things like that. And again, communication is very important. Increase visibility with your partners, with your team members and upper management. A lot of you are in charge of directing the African business group for large organizations. Your organization will be relying on you to come up with ways to keep investing in Africa. So make sure you're, even at this time, is communicating with them and telling them what plans are in the making. So now let's take another poll question. So what short-term response tactics have you implemented so far? So choose all that apply. It goes from A, safeguarded my employees, all the way to the last, none of the above. So take some time to respond.
I'll give a few more seconds to get some responses in. And then once we go through the poll, Nefemi, we do have a few questions that have come in.
Okay.
All right, ending the poll. And here are the results.
All right, so it seems the main tactic that people are adopting is frequent communication with customers, partners, and employees, and also staying up to date with the situation on the ground. These are very important things as you think about your business. So let's go ahead and take a question as we move along.
All right, so one question we have from Chris Osborne is, will the oil price challenge compound COVID-19 responses in parts of Africa?
All right, thanks, Chris, for that question. Definitely, we think that is going to be a major factor. The oil prices we're seeing, it's at all-time low, right? We even saw the US oil prices go into a negative, I think 2 days ago. So that is definitely going to compound things for countries that are dependent on oil prices, particularly Nigeria, Angola, I believe Egypt also. And because the demand for oil has drastically reduced and oversupply in the system, this is going to dry up some revenue sources for these big economies. And it'll be very interesting to see how these countries manage their revenue, especially as we're going through this system. So definitely.
Another question, Nefemi, we have, is there any correlation between access to testing and socioeconomic status?
That's a good question. So maybe one of the health people can, so I see Sarah put her hands up. So Sarah, do you want to answer that?
Yes, absolutely. There is a correlation, and it's not only in Africa, it's everywhere around the world. Socioeconomic status heavily impacts whether you access healthcare or not. And it's not just about the test for COVID, but that's certainly one thing. There's actually a tool that I saw the US government developed very recently to try to measure the impact of COVID on different populations within the US. So looking at how it affects African Americans and how it affects Hispanics and how it affects different populations in the US. And that is because there's a lot of complaints about people from lower socioeconomic statuses around the world not getting proper access to healthcare. And usually when you have a crisis, all of these disparities and inequalities are exasperated, sorry. So yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to add anything.
Cool. That's good. Thank you very much.
Okay, and for the interest of time, we do have a few more questions. We're going to move on. I think these questions will be answered as we go through the rest.
Yep. All right, so let's just move on. So, Cyril, if you don't mind, from a short-term perspective, can you tell us how you as a business owner in Ghana, you're being impacted by COVID-19? You're in the real estate.
Sorry, I'm struggling to hear you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I saw you better. Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so I just wanted to find out as a business owner how the outbreak is impacting your business. And also, if you can just give us some sense of, even though in Ghana they're taking off this travel ban, how is it going to impact hotels in the sense of trying to implement social distancing tactics for tourism? If you have any sense on how that.
Yeah, okay. So the impact, so just to give you guys a bit of background, so we are real estate developers based here in Accra, Ghana. And our primary vision really is to deliver real estate solutions to the growing middle income class of Ghanaians. Now that means that, you know, we do office buildings, we do residential buildings, we do hospitality developments that can be supported by the local market. Now, what we see in our markets today is that a lot of developers are focusing on the demand from international companies, right? So a good example, which is quite relevant today, is Aker Energy recently signed a $4.4 billion oil exploration project that was supposed to commence this year. Now that has been suspended as of a month ago, mainly because of COVID-19. A country like the US, for instance, repatriated 1,400 Americans back to the US until we are able to get control over this pandemic. Now, what that has in terms of an impact on real estate is that we're losing demand. So Acre, for example, would have brought some demand for office space. Now we don't have it. These 1,400 tenants or Americans who were renting apartments are no longer here. Now, in these markets, people pay rents typically 6 months to a year up front. So you can say short-term wise, landlords are cushioned, but what happens after that? You know, are these people coming back? You know, and if they're coming back, are they going to renew their leases? So the impact on our market is quite significant, especially if you look at the demand, the key demand drivers. Hospitality, for example, is forecasted to have a drop in occupancy rates from 70% to 30%. I mean, borders are going to will continue to stay closed for the next 3 months. That means we don't have any traffic from business or tourists, right? But, you know, in all this, you know, it's an opportunity for real estate developers to really look back at their business models. Focus more on the local market, right? Because, you know, even if the market bounces back, it's going to take a while for, you know, international or multinational companies to come back into the country to comfortably do business. That means your solution has to be catered to the local market. Figure out a way to incorporate more local content, more local materials into your projects. Now, we end up importing a lot of our finishing materials from Europe and the US. Let's figure out how we can rather use local materials to finish some of these parts of the development project, which in the end will actually help develop our local market. You know, another thing that we need to do smarter is our project execution strategies. a lot of projects have gotten stalled, and because of the way they were executed, they have no other option but to either cut their losses or finish the project, right? Whereas if they embarked on a phasing strategy where you're able to do phase one, allow it to be absorbed into market, and then move into phase two, so that if something happens between a phase one and phase two, you're able to re-strategize and either come up with a different product or cancel the project altogether. And lastly, I think it's also an opportunity to start looking at new asset classes, right? Most developers here look at more at commercial office space and residential, but this might be an opportunity to look at, smart warehousing and logistics, where, in the US, companies like Amazon continue to do good business, and they're actually hiring people because people still need products, but, they need a logistics, a very efficient logistics system infrastructure in place to make sure they get their product. So I think, overall impact is huge on real estate, but there are some opportunities for us to rethink how we deliver real estate and who our key target market is.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Cyril. Thank you for that. It's very interesting to see how people are responding now and also thinking about innovating along the line. So let me keep moving on for sake of time. Any new questions that we can quickly address?
Yes, Nathaniel, we do have quite a number of questions, but I think for the interest of time, we have hit our 45-minute mark, so I'm going to save the questions to the end.
Okay.
I know we have about 10 to 15 minutes more of material to get through.
All right, so let me just move on to long term. I think Cyril already kind of touched on that a little bit. Let me put out this poll. Are you currently developing a long-term strategy for your business in Africa post-COVID-19? Goes from option A, yes, we've made good progress, to option E, not quite sure where to start. Take a few seconds to populate that.
I'll give 10 more seconds for everyone to get in their responses. All right, and the poll is ending.
All right, so it seems 50% say yes, but they're having some challenges, which is very expected. Thinking long-term is quite difficult right now, and I think we're all in the same boat, but coming together like this are different ways for us to kind of think about the future. All right, so moving on. Usually the best business managers in a situation of crisis develop a long-term strategy by having I call it a winning balance between protecting and optimizing for the short term, minimizing loss, reducing risk, but also thinking about the long term. So it's a balancing act, to say. Some of the growth opportunities would be, how do you develop new markets? How do you innovate your business model to fit what is actually needed in the African market as we see it post-COVID? Also building some kind of logistics resilience, as Cyril kind of pointed out. So the winning balance here is just continue to monitor each African market and prioritize the ones that in the short term where you can minimize your losses, and then develop new markets for the long term to capture some market share by innovating your business model. These are some considerations that we have and focus areas. The healthcare, we all know this is a healthcare crisis. We know that African countries have not been prioritizing healthcare in general, and there's going to be more priority around the healthcare healthcare solutions. So how do you think about your own business, even though if you're not in healthcare, how do you find ways to boost the healthcare in Africa? Perhaps you're in the automotive industry. Think about ways that you can support the healthcare system help your partners find new customers that are trying to support the healthcare system. Also, just building redundancy in your supply chain. Thinking of Africa as, since we know what has happened, where most of the things that we're importing actually even comes from China, the first place that was hit by this crisis. Thinking of how to build resilient warehousing and storage facilities across the continent, and even thinking of how this plugs into your global supply chain strategy to supply other countries, whether it's South America and places around Africa. So thinking of how you plug into your global strategy. Also, local self-sufficiency. Countries are around the world are going into a very protective, let's protect our citizens. And the same thing is going to be happening in Africa. It's saying we don't have a choice. So local production is possibly going to be optimized, prioritized. How do you and your business, how are you thinking about boosting local production in terms of training and educating people, and also providing equipment, power, and road infrastructure? And a lot of markets are still commodity driven, agriculture and natural resources, thinking of how to boost yields, how to improve extraction processes, and also how to help in the value chain of moving these products around. And finally, we're all thinking about this. There are going to be new ways of doing business, just like we're doing now, talking and having this webcast online. A lot of business in Africa, to build relationship, requires a lot of face-to-face meetings. And we know that most of people that are in charge have to travel around the entire year to go into different countries. So how do you use technology and tools to kind of reduce your travel cost by engaging with partners that are willing to conduct business online? And so finally, these are some of our considerations. Obviously, there'll be more, but let's hear from a business owner in Nigeria right now. Andrew, if you don't mind telling us how you are thinking about long-term opportunities in Nigeria and Africa in general.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Nifemi. So just by way of background, so I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Life Stores Healthcare. We own a chain of mass market focused pharmacies in Nigeria. And then we also have a software platform that we developed for pharmacies to help them operate more efficiently. In terms of some of the long-term considerations, I mean, I think at the country level, there's the consideration that was mentioned earlier of kind of the oil producing countries versus non-oil producing countries. So kind of the Nigerias, the Angolas, the Mozambiques of the world, probably having a rebound that takes a little bit longer, and which is kind of heavily tied to the oil price rebound, which
Oops. It seems we might have lost Andrew there. Let's give him a few seconds to see if it comes back.
In the meantime, if anyone wants to take a question.
Sure. Any questions?
So one question we have from Rodolfo is how COVID has changed the long-term healthcare projects in Africa. And this is very now.
So I wonder if Mambi can help with that question. What's the question again?
How COVID-19 has changed long-term healthcare projects in Africa.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think, like I mentioned before, about 60% of healthcare is delivered, healthcare services are delivered by the private sector. And this is a really tough time for them because, you know, ultimately patients are not going to be coming either out of fear or because they've been closed down. And I think coming out of that will be quite challenging. also with just things going down in the economy, you also have to worry now about people's ability to pay for healthcare services, which may, make investors less likely to want to go forward with the bigger projects if it's unlikely that at the end of the day the patients won't be able to pay for that, either through insurance or other means. What we may find is more of a focus on smaller hospitals, public health, sort of mass market plays, as opposed to too much more investment in tertiary that requires more capex. But yeah, that's kind of where I see things potentially going, but one never knows. I think it's new for everyone, so the jury's still out.
All right. Cool. Thanks, Mambi. Sarah seems to want to add to that.
Yeah, I just had a quick note on what donors are doing in a lot of countries. So, there are a lot of funds from the UK, for example, and the US that have typically prioritized things like trying to stabilize countries and trying to avoid conflicts. And because COVID right now is a big potential trigger for instability, a lot of these funds are being redirected to respond to COVID. And so the priorities of donors are changing. And the donors that previously didn't prioritize healthcare system strengthening are now reconsidering that and investing more in healthcare system strengthening. So we are expected to see that shift. Also governments, I can't say if governments are going to prioritize healthcare system strengthening or not. Maybe it depends on the situation and the regime that you're dealing with. But I can definitely say that especially Western donors are prioritizing it more.
Okay. Hey, thank you very much for that update. I think we have Andrew back. And Andrew cut off there, maybe the Lagos internet.
Yes, exactly. But thanks, guys, for those other comments on opportunities. So I think the couple buckets I was seeing things in were in terms of government and consumer behavior, and and heard Mambi and Sarah talk a little bit about those kind of pushes for self-sufficiency and stronger healthcare systems. So I think probably no need to dwell on that. And then in terms of the other bucket around consumer behavior, seeing potential changes coming in terms of communication, how people relate to each other given COVID, and then on the delivery side as well. So people potentially ordering more and that being kind of becoming a new means of distribution to the end consumer. I think a couple of the interesting ways we've been able to leverage that so far in our own business. So we've kicked off a teleconsultation program where people can dial in and link up right away with the pharmacist to give them a consultation on basic medical issues. And then we've also kicked off a delivery program as well, where people can order. I think on the delivery side, it will be fascinating for all of us in businesses related to kind of the mass market segment in African countries to keep our eyes on the extent to which COVID changes ordering behavior in that segment. I would say from our own business, so far we've seen that in terms of customer segments on kind of the upper middle to upper class segment, the demand for deliveries has certainly increased. In that mass market segment, we haven't yet seen an increase, likely due to delivery costs, but this may change over time as delivery costs come down, or if people start to prioritize delivery more highly.
Awesome.
So a couple thoughts from my side.
Nice. Thank you very much, Andrew. And it seems things are still moving along, and as we all still think about responding right now and in the long term. In the sake of time, I think we're over our time limits. And I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining. We'll still hang around to take some more questions. First, I want to thank my panelists for joining. I really appreciate your time. And also thanking everybody that attended. We just trying to come together to find ways to brainstorm new solutions, since we know that the response in the short term and the long term are very important. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. My email is right there. And if you're looking to connect with any of the experts that we have on the panel, reach out to us and we'll definitely put you in contact. We'll stay around for any more questions, but please feel free to leave and hop off the call if necessary. But thank you very much for joining and attending. Are there any questions left?
Yes, so we have about 3 questions. One question from Wole. From a CDC Africa perspective, what criteria has been shared with countries as measures that will guide reopening closed borders, considering the current protectionist policies adopted by most countries across the continent?
Okay, let me repeat that question, and hopefully Mambi or Sarah can answer. You're experts on this. So from a CDC Africa perspective, what criteria has been shared with countries as measures that will guide reopening closed borders, considering the current protectionist policies adopted by most countries across the continent?
And to summarize, I think this question is just getting at what is the criteria the CDC has laid out as countries are rolling out of the isolation or protectionist type phases of the lockdown, curfew, etc.
So Mambi, do you have a perspective?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there is something that is being put out. As far as I'm aware, I think each country is so far making those decisions. We'll see how long that lasts in terms of the economic, because obviously you have to balance the economic component with people not being able, so borders are closed to people but not to goods and and products. But yeah, I would say once you have balance in that, then they'll be able to open up. But as to what the specific guidelines are, I'm not sure at this time.
I agree. I don't think there are guidelines. I mean, I might be wrong, but my understanding is that African countries are yet to reach their peak for this outbreak. And so I don't expect that there are guidelines yet in terms of reopening borders and how to do that, because there is still developing the guidelines in terms of how to actually deal with the situation as it stands right now and how to limit it from growing into a crisis that healthcare systems really can't handle. So I don't think that there are guidelines regarding reopening borders and how to do that.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Thanks. So I wonder if there's supposed to be some guidelines from, I don't know who or the African Union. I think every country is just taking it as they see it. So
we have another
any other question?
From Mohit Jaggi, and the question is how is this situation going to impact the foreign exchange reserves as many economies are low, and how are they going to prioritize releasing the foreign exchange reserves? So I think in general, just the impacts of foreign exchange and the reserves in particular.
Okay. So definitely this is going to be a big impact, as we've talked about countries that are commodity dependent, especially those that are reliant on oil right now. Reserves are reducing, and so it's definitely putting pressure on the local currency. other countries that are not so commodity dependent are now also trying to allocate more of their resources towards the healthcare sector, which was not prioritized before. So that's why there's a big thing with the whole debt repayments, because there are some African countries that are actually, they pay more a year to service their debts than they put towards healthcare. There are a good number of African countries like that. So definitely is something to monitor for each country. You probably want to pay attention to like what each country's central bank is saying. You also want to make sure you're kind of verifying the information, because what the agency is saying might not necessarily be reflecting what's really happening. But you definitely want to keep an eye on, you know, the fact that revenues for these commodity dependent countries might be drying up, since trade is not even happening right now. And that is definitely going to put some pressure on the currency. And, you know, we at this point it's just kind of taking a day at a time, you know, and seeing like, okay, what's really going on? Would things bounce back as soon as, you know, they start opening trade? But at the same time, are we at our peak yet? Yeah, so these are things that, you know, there's still a lot of uncertainty. So I don't know if we have any more questions, but please feel free to email me or anything if you have any more questions, and we'll look through some of the Q&A to see if there are questions that have been left unanswered. Thank you very, very much for your time. And we'll end this webcast now. And thanks again to my panelists. Thank you, Mambi. Thank you, Sarah, Jonathan, Cyril, and Andrew. Thank you very much for joining. Really appreciate you. And thanks to all the people that attended.